Well, welcome everyone to our third evening in the basement, and to those who are joining us from elsewhere, welcome to you too. It's very appropriate, as we said I think last week, that we're meeting in the basement. It's probably the last place that we want to come to, metaphorically speaking, and it's probably the last place that we might expect God to meet us. But in fact, most commonly, He meets us in that place where we're in the dark, alone, perhaps a little bit frightened, where the things that we're talking about, fear and anxiety and guilt and shame, get the better of us. We like to pretend that it's all nice and bright and sunny and rosy, but actually it's in the dark space often that we learn the most about ourselves and about God. So it's a very appropriate place to meet. But there is another part of the story here in the basement. This is one of the oldest houses in the Barossa Valley in South Australia, and the basement in which we are meeting tonight used to be a workshop. In fact, the cafe above us was the family home of the Shardle family, and this basement was the furniture or cabinet making workshop. And it's appropriate because in this very space, lots of things have been put together. And there's been probably some things that have been taken apart and put back together. And that's also a bit of a parable. God often puts us back together. Sometimes He has to take us apart a bit to put us back together. And if I may share a personal story in relation to that. Many years ago, after my first wife died, I was in a very dark place where the sun wasn't shining, and it was just thunder and lightning, and everything seemed to have closed in. And my very best friend said to me, "Noel, it's okay. God is a very safe place to unravel." And that has stuck with me ever since. God is a very safe place to unravel. And if through these talks you're finding that God's putting things back together, or there's been a bit of unravelling going on, it's all part of a bigger picture that belongs to our health and well-being. Or to change the image a little bit, I don't know if old Mr. Shardle ever made musical instruments down here, but sometimes a violin can be too tightly strung, and not only then is it off-key, but it also damages the instrument. And perhaps in discussions like this, you can just take the tension off the strings a little bit, to unwind a little bit and have a bit of a conversation about things that matter. So welcome tonight, and welcome to those who are joining us, as we said, from elsewhere. As we said, we're talking about issues that feature in everyone's life to one degree or another, but are often not commonly spoken about. Guilt and anxiety and fear and shame. They top the bestseller lists. People are always searching for them online. The TED Talks and those sort of things in relation to these topics are very heavily downloaded. But to have a good and honest conversation about it, it means that you need to be a bit vulnerable and expose some of your inner weaknesses to yourself and to one another and to God. And particularly here tonight, we're starting to talk about guilt and shame more next week, but guilt and shame are very closely related. Just like anxiety and fear were very closely related, guilt and shame are very closely connected. And wherever they are, there's no shortage of anxiety and fear as well. Tonight we're going to be looking primarily at guilt, but we will be touching on the topic of shame, and we'll go more into that in more detail next week. So as we've begun in the last couple of weeks, is there anyone here who has never felt guilty? Okay, so you're all candidates for a conversation then. Is there anyone here who has not felt guilty at all at any part of the last 24 hours? Okay, so it's a fairly fresh conversation then, isn't it? It's not as though it's something we have to dredge through past history to find. Guilt is primarily about actions, is it not? It's about actions that we feel, where we feel we have transgressed some sort of standard, either a standard set by ourselves or someone else. Shame tends not to be so much about actions, but about identity. Guilt is about what we've done. Shame is about who we are. Guilt is action related. Shame is identity related. Feelings of guilt are not the same as actual guilt. Like both with guilt and shame, there's an internal component and an external component. So internally, you may feel very guilty about something, which externally, there's no break of any law anywhere. But conversely, there might be a broken law out there somewhere externally and you have no guilt about it at all. They often say, don't they, that there are no guilty men in prison. And the reason they say that is because if you speak to someone who's serving their time, very often they say, I'm not guilty, I didn't do it. Or if I did do it, well, the rotter had it coming to it, you know. Someone had to do it. He was just waiting for it, you know. So we offload our guilt, we shift our guilt, and the external guilt and the internal guilt don't always match closely. They're connected through our conscience, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to get you to do something around your tables, and for those who are joining us elsewhere, you can join in this as well. The first exercise around the tables is this. What happens when you feel guilty? What happens when you feel guilty? Like, we all know what it is to feel guilty. But this is asking you to examine what happens when you feel guilty. So think about the emotions that arise in your heart when you feel guilty. What emotions are forefront? And what relational things happen when you're feeling guilty? So the emotional side, the affect, the relational side. Now, some people might be really comfortable about giving specific examples, some people might not. Just to the degree that you're comfortable, share something from your own experience. But what do you actually feel when you feel guilty? So to tease away behind the question of what guilt is, to say what guilt actually does to me. Does that make sense to you? And then see if there's any common themes that emerge around your table. We'll give you a little bit of time to talk and we'll come back. Let's bring ourselves back together again. So perhaps it was a little bit of a vague and woolly question, but what sort of things happen to you when you feel guilty? What are the emotions that are triggered and the relational issues that are kicked off when you're feeling guilty?
We talked about how we worry, instantly worry about it, and then it sort of goes to a fear, you know.
All right.
Okay. You know, what could be happening here then? You know, what have I done?
Okay.
So worry and fear.
So where did you think the worry and the fear come from in that guilt space? Not sure?
Well, there's a sense of, okay, I may have done something here, I'm feeling guilty about something, so, you know, and then you start worrying about the implications of what could be happening through that and how it could affect others, and then it all gets a bit scary.
Like driving past a speed camera and checking your
that type of thing.
Yeah,
yes.
Okay, and you're wondering whether that really got you or not. Yeah.
Or a feeling that you might be found out, even though you make out, as growing up, that's what I did sometimes. You make out it wasn't you, it's one of the other brothers and sisters, not me. But you don't feel right. But you fear that you will be found out anyway in the long run. So I think that ties out.
So guilt and secrecy go together,
Yeah.
and there's fear around this idea of
Yes.
being found out, but at the same time you're also shifting something off to someone else.
Yeah, I think someone said that here, didn't you? Just the idea that, and the reason I did it was because of such and such. So you make excuses. I was tired, or it was late, or she shouldn't have done what she did, or something like that. And it really ruins relationships.
Yeah, no one ever does that in this room, do they?
No, only me.
Actually, we'll come back to that a little later this evening. It's actually a really significant point. Thank you. Anyone else have a comment?
I think guilt is really a self-perception. So it's really the story we tell ourselves, not necessarily the story that's played out. So we might do something quite trivial and then just sort of go over it in our mind, and it becomes something that didn't even really, if you actually spoke to the person, it might not have even happened, but it just sort of, it's that feeling and that story we tell ourselves, not necessarily, the actual truth.
Yes.
Necessarily.
Yes. Our story, which is your point about what happened, and the other person's story, if there is another person, they will never be exactly the same. Everyone perceives something through the lens of their own guilt or shame on the one hand, or their own desire to be seen to be right. People develop narratives within families. Would you like to comment on that, darling? It's not something that we plan to comment on now. But.
No, I was just thinking as you're reflecting on that, that idea that if, for example, there are 5 children growing up in one family, there are in some ways 5 different families, not including the parents' experience of growing up in that family. So if you think if you've got siblings or cousins, you may have been through, lived in the same family circle, but your experience of growing up with mum and dad or auntie and uncle or grandma and granddad may be very, very different to the experience of your brothers or cousins. And so in that sense it's quite subjective, and one person may feel that they're very deeply damaged by a family upbringing, whilst a sibling just a few years older may feel that they had a wonderful family.
Just to come back a step, in a general way, we've admitted tonight everyone feels guilt at some point or shame. At what point do they become problematic for us, in terms of medical practice or psychological experience? Or perhaps even to put it another way, in what sense does the lack of them become problematic?
So I think in some ways you can understand guilt as an experience of judgment within the person, even if we're not aware of that. It's not just Christians that feel guilty, even though if you ask an atheist or agnostic person, they may paint a picture of things being that way, of Christian guilt or Catholic guilt. But actually all of us experience guilt, and some of it I think is that deep sense that we have about not living life authentically. And I don't mean by that that we have to be true to ourselves, but actually we're not living life the way that we were created to be, and we sense that in our innermost being. I think that guilt, the picture I have about guilt is that of, you imagine lots of soccer balls that are inflated and they're in the ocean, and you're trying to hold them, you're trying to keep them down below the surface, and they keep popping up all the time. And I think that's what guilt is like in our consciences, because we're not made in any way for guilt, and so we do all these things to try and keep it below the surface, and to try and justify ourselves, which I guess we'll get to a little later. But that exhausts us, that wears us out, whilst our conscience is busy trying to kind of play its cards right, so that the guilty hand doesn't come up and isn't seen by everybody. There was a psychiatrist, a famous psychiatrist called Tournier, who said that guilt is the seasoning of our everyday lives. So he said that guilt is just endemic, you can't escape it. So if you even think, perhaps some of you have been writing tonight, I feel guilty every time I write because no one can read it, let alone myself.
Well, you're a doctor.
But we feel guilty when we open our emails, for example, because of the emails from good friends that maybe have been sitting there for months that we haven't responded to, or we see our sick neighbour down the street who we haven't had time to drop in on. Or we make laws for ourselves, like I'm going to go on the treadmill every day for the rest of my life for half an hour a day, and I'm not going to eat sugar and I'm not going to eat fat. So we make laws for ourselves, and then of course, as soon as we break them, they may not be God's laws, but we break them, and then we feel guilty and we feel bad about ourselves, and then we have to do something to assuage that guilt to try and make up for it. So we see that that's just part and parcel of who we are. Coming down to a more medical model, I think it's important to note that guilt can be a symptom of some mental health conditions. And so, for example, depression, one of the signs of depression can be the feeling of an overly guilty conscience, so that we constantly have that overwhelming sense of guilt, sense of having done something wrong, even if you can't put your finger on what it was. And very little things trigger off our conscience. It keeps us awake at night time and on edge during the day and fatigued during the day. In terms of mental health, I think we can also think about not just an excess of guilt, but perhaps the absence of guilt, which can be a sign, or which we see displayed, for example, in antisocial personality disorder. So people who have a just flagrant disregard for other people's emotions, for the law. We see that in perhaps developing in children who are abusive towards animals, who drown kittens, grow up into men or women who are abusive to spouses, but can also be very, very charming in order to get what they want. So classically they have perhaps not an absence of guilt, but a dulled sense of guilt.
Can I, again, we're a bit out of sequence, but can I just ask you to turn the thing the other way? Because one of the problems we often face is that we're guilted into doing things, if I can turn a noun into a verb, that we're made to feel guilty unless we do something to help someone, or, someone needs, the church needs something and no one else will do it. So out of guilt we do stuff. So, and some of us, I think, become very vulnerable to that. We become overburdened. So what's going on there? Why do some of us find it very easy to be manipulated by guilt or guilted into some action?
I suppose we'd say that some of us, and perhaps we'd have to say genetically and through the way that we've been brought up, perhaps some baggage that's been inadvertently handed down to us through our families of origin, have very sensitised consciences to guilt. I think there's the idea that some of us in particular have a great sense of inferiority and are therefore easily manipulated, because we really want to feel good, we really want to look good, we really want to do good. And so we're very easily manipulated, and our consciences are terrified if one person doesn't like us, or if internally if we feel that we've done the wrong thing, we've not lived up to the expectations. But in reality, I think that's just the way that our society runs. So if we look at a lot of campaigns on television, perhaps if you think in the past, some of the quit smoking campaigns have made you feel pretty guilty. The advertisements, not saying that they're bad, but the advertisements about not texting when you're driving or not drinking and driving, because think about who will you leave behind, are essentially designed to make you feel guilty. So they're trying to get some action out of guilt. We see that in the cosmetic industry or in an Instagram. We feel guilty and turn on ourselves if we don't meet a particular body image. But that makes money, so there's propaganda in society which hinges on us feeling guilty.
That would be close to shame?
That's right. So I suppose shame is more that sense of where your guilt has been just about, I have done something wrong. That transition into, I am wrong.
Yeah.
So shame is, I am wrong, and it's in a very public sphere. I think guilt can overlap with shame. Shame, once perhaps the wrong that we feel we've done becomes a public wrong, like someone was saying earlier, that sense of being found out and what will the implications be. And so we tend to hide our guilt lest it become shame, lest we become shamed in the congregation or in our neighbourhoods or in our workplaces. And that actually just exacerbates it. It's just another strategy to keep the balls under the water while they're really popping up everywhere.
Thank you. Just at your tables, again, to the degree that you feel comfortable to do so, to what degree has guilt been an issue for you? To what degree has it been something that has really affected you or your relationships? And if you feel comfortable, but only if you do, perhaps an example or two of that. And then, again, just to see if there's any common themes that emerge around the table, because I don't think any one person's story is a million miles removed from any other person's story when it comes to these things. So in what way has guilt, in the way that we've been speaking about it, been a problem for you? And how has that manifested itself relationally for you? Take some time. Is there anyone who'd like to bring a comment back to the whole group? An area that might be a little bit closer to the bone for some of us.
Well, I think it's good that a dad in this group shared that he can feel guilty because his children will put guilt on him because we should go to the football again or should go somewhere. And that sort of thing, I think, easily happens. And I think the church puts guilt on people. And
No.
they don't know how. I'm sorry, but I think that can happen. Maybe we were guilty of it too in a parish, when you think about it. Yeah. Because guilt is a terrible motivator. It is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'd like to just pick up something that we started saying earlier and said we'd come back to, and that is this issue of the relationship between guilt and conscience. Because we can often think that conscience is sort of like the voice of God. And if you just listen to your conscience, everything will be good. But in fact, your conscience needs to be rehabilitated and redeemed as much as the rest of you. Your conscience actually, so to speak, looks for a North Pole. It looks for something to align itself with. And depending on your upbringing, your culture, perhaps some of your own internal machinations as well, your conscience may be aligned to things that are very important for you, but other people's are completely aligned to a different set of things. So that, for example, in some places where Kirsten and I visit from time to time, many of us in this room would be causing great offence tonight because we have women here wearing trousers, for example, or with their arms uncovered. Can you see that there's certain things that we can be aligned to that culturally and socially we think, well, that's really important. And yet in another setting, those things seem to be of no consequence, and very often worldviews come into conflict, violent conflict sometimes, because consciences are aligned to different things. So a person's conscience is not an infallible guide to the truth. It has to be aligned to something true itself. Does that make sense? Yeah?
So like everything else in our body.
Sorry?
Everything else in our bodies and wills need to be realigned, renewed, and the conscience is no difference.
That's right. Exactly the case. Exactly the case. Yeah, please, sweetie.
Just in regard to the comment, which I think is so true, that even churches use guilt, and I think perhaps above all institutions, perhaps religious institutions use guilt to manoeuvre people. And I'm just making an observation, which may be wrong, but just an observation. There's this sense that we get that perhaps people and pastors and evangelists need to feel that they have to really get someone by the throat and convict them of their guilt. I remember when I was a teenager and we would do street evangelism in the mall, and we'd have little brochures that we'd hand out, and I don't know if they called it the Roman road, that may not be correct, but essentially the task was to point out to someone their sin. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, therefore that is you. You're a dirty, rotten sinner. Don't you know you need God's grace and forgiveness? But actually, I wonder if that's coming about things completely upside down. And I think actually we can only see our sin once we know the goodness of God. And I think of the drama, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Was it Quasimodo, the ugly, deformed hunchback who fell in love with the beautiful...
Esmeralda.
That's right, fell in love with the beautiful woman, and he's called out to her, I didn't know how ugly I was until I saw how beautiful you were. And so I think that's how God comes to us. It's that actually God comes to us first and sweeps us off our feet.
This question of conscience, often people, because guilt is endemic, like you said, and everyone's got a conscience, even if it's wrongly aligned to something. You commonly hear people say, you just need to learn to forgive yourself. Or you give yourself permission not to feel guilty. You reframe it, so you give yourself permission not to feel guilty. What do you think about all of that?
Look, I think perhaps the only thought that I've had about that is that it's as if we have these multiple selves, and that somehow we have one self who's saying to the other self, I forgive you. So I don't know where that other self who's offering the forgiveness comes in, and who's forgiven them, or who gives them the right to forgive this other self. And so that idea, it's certainly part of pop psychology, and we do see it around the place, and we see it in self-help books and New Age books. But logically, I just don't think that it carries weight with the conscience. I think that our conscience is not so easily fooled, and I think it might work for a few moments. It might work for a day. It might work for a little bit longer, but I really don't think it works for very long at all.
Thank you. We're going to take a break just now. After we come back, we'll pick up where we left off. And if there's things in between that you would like to ask about or make comments on, let's do that over the break, and we can bring some of those back into the room after we've had our supper. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed supper. When we left off, we were just starting to nudge into some of those questions about how we cope with guilt, and the questions about how we put guilt off. Someone before the break used the used the term justifying yourself or something to that effect. We'll come to that in a minute, but just to ask Kirsten, we've talked about the negative effects of guilt so far. Can guilt ever be healthy? Is it ever an adaptive thing for us?
Look, I think the answer has to be yes, that guilt can be healthy. And I guess if we think before when we mentioned the complete absence of guilt in the face of perhaps terrible injustices that are carried out towards other people or nations or groups that are carried out without any sense of guilt. So I suppose in that sense, guilt is something that, yes, it weighs us down, but perhaps there isn't a restraint element. So if you could imagine a world where, this world, I don't mean heaven, but imagine a world where nobody ever felt guilty. I don't mean that nobody was ever objectively guilty, because there's a difference between subjective guilt and objective guilt. But if you can imagine a world where nobody ever felt guilty, I think we would probably see what you see perhaps after cyclones where the police are tied up elsewhere, or after war where there's looting and because you're not going to get caught perhaps. So yes, I think that guilt does have a function. I suspect it also perhaps could be used as I have a picture of an Australian sheepdog kind of bringing the sheep into the pen, and perhaps God uses guilt in that sense, even though in some ways he's not the author of guilt at all. Will use guilt to drive people towards himself. I think in the other sense, perhaps the devil uses guilt to drive them deeper to him, and the devil uses guilt to turn us inwards. And to turn us into ourselves and against one another.
Thank you. Coming back to this question of self-justification, it's obvious, it's been long recognised that the easiest way to offload an uncomfortable sense of guilt is to blame someone or something else. It's not my fault, or to find an excuse, or in some other way say that whatever it is that we've done is excusable. Many years ago I heard a story from a friend of mine who was walking along a railway platform interstate when they still had railways, and the friend was walking with an older bloke, and the older fellow said to him, as they were coming up to a group of workers, when you walk past, just listen. They'll be bad-mouthing someone. And sure enough, as they got closer, these blokes were just going off. In this instance, it was about their boss. And the younger bloke said to the older fellow, what was going on? How did you know that they would be doing that? He said, well, it's not their break time, it's not lunchtime. They're supposed to be working, and they're sitting around playing cards, so they're guilty. So they have to offload it somehow. I thought, goodness, what an insight into human behaviour. But how does that self-justifying thing work? How does it work for us in terms of rationalising our actions? On the one hand, we can remove the guilt by criticising someone else. And most often, not always, but very often, you'll find that people are most critical in others of the thing they most despise about themselves. But the other thing that we can do is to find excuse or to blame shift. And that blame shifting and not taking responsibility finally for what we've done lies at the root of all sorts of issues, not least addictive issues. So just in terms of your background professionally and so forth, how does that play out, this extended sense of blame shifting, self-justifying as a means of offloading guilt? What happens? What do you see?
Well, look, I think feelings of guilt really cause a build-up of tension in all of us, and it's a tension that we were never designed or created to carry, and it's a tension that we can't live with. And so we really have a couple of options, I suppose. We can accept responsibility for what we've done, but in the ways that our consciences work, perhaps when they're not under grace, or perhaps when they're not hearing that word of grace, that's really never a valid option for us. So if you notice that we always are pretty quick to run to the other option, which is to blame someone else. And if you just listen to the way that we speak, we do it all the time. So I might forget somebody's name and I just say, look, I'm just a forgetful person. You know, I was born that way, you know, you just have to forgive me. And whilst it's not a bad, sure, it doesn't really matter, maybe that you've forgotten somebody's name, but immediately we shift the blame. So perhaps I shift the blame to my parents. Or we might see, perhaps in a counselling context, that a woman who loves her hubby very much but is out in public with him, and perhaps he has some mannerisms that she finds really embarrassing, and she is, you know, feeling humiliated, and again this ties into shame, but she says to her friends, look, he can't help it, he was brought up that way. So really that's shifting the blame to the mother-in-law. And so you might think, well, that's pretty harmless, she's not blaming her husband, but then suddenly to justify that in her mind, the mother-in-law really has to become an ogre of a person who's responsible for the way that her husband has been brought up. So we see these dances that take place all the time. Somebody comes into my practice 10 minutes late for a 15-minute appointment, and it's never their fault. Like I know that psychologically they're pretty healthy if they can say, look, it's completely my fault that I was late and we've only got 5 minutes left and I'll rebook. But it's very rarely that it's the husband didn't get out of bed and didn't set the alarm clock and he forgot to put the petrol in the car, or it's the children that slept in, and boy, when I get home, those children are going to get it. But it's never our fault. And so we shift the blame because creationally we can't handle the tension of that guilt. I think we see that also when we have guilty feelings about having left something undone or done something that we ought not to have done. That can turn inwards, and that can quickly become a depression or an anxiety disorder. And I suspect that when that happens, it's actually we're trying to punish ourselves, because guilt and punishment are linked. Guilt and judgment and punishment are linked. And we feel that we deserve somehow to be punished so that then we can be let off the hook.
Interesting. That wasn't me she was talking about, by the way. A husband in public who's got annoying mannerisms. Not really. You always have. Just around your tables, again, to the degree that you feel comfortable, what are your blame shifting patterns? How does that work out for you? What do you do, and how do those around you handle it? Might be a bit too close to the bone to talk, might be a very silent session. See how you get on. Any comments from any of the tables? Holly?
I don't really have anyone to talk to, but I would say it's very easy to, when you don't want to repeat guilt, that whatever the wrongdoing is has come from good intentions, and you didn't mean for it to happen, even though it has happened, but I meant the best, or the good intentions were, even though down base level, I've done wrong or if it hurt someone, you try and explain it away as, but it was the best intention. I thought that we get a different result. So.
Yeah. Who was it who said the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Yeah. One of the things that we'll look at tonight, one of the passages of Scripture, is a very well known one, I'm sure, to us all. It's from Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 18, verses 9 down to 14. It's not a very long passage. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 down to 14. And if there's one or two different versions around your table, different translations, get it read in a couple of different Bibles. And then ask yourself this question, where and how do you see self-justification or blame shifting or excuse making? Have a look at that for a little while. What did you discover?
We're always justifying ourselves, always, constantly justifying ourselves for everything that we do wrong, don't we?
100% of the time, aren't we? Yeah.
And it was all the others who were bad, not me.
Mm-hmm.
They were just awful, and he's justifying himself to God all the time.
Mm.
And if he was as broken as all the rest. Or even the tax collector, Jesus made a point, didn't he? Even that man over there.
Yeah, culturally it was the most disgusting profession that you could adopt.
Yes.
Because it had nothing to do finally with the justice of the tax system. Because those who were collecting taxes were both traitorous, working for the occupying power, and they always rendered themselves ritually unclean because of their contact with the non-Jewish people. So, they were the lowest of the low.
Like Zacchaeus up the tree, he was one of them too, wasn't he?
Yeah. Zacchaeus up the tree was one of them. But I'm not sure if you picked up the statement at the beginning where Jesus talks about some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. Now, what other words do you have there for contempt?
Jesus told the story of some people who thought they were better than others and who looked down on everyone else.
Look down, yeah. It's an interesting fact that wherever there's hatred, there must be self-righteousness.
Interesting.
Wherever there's hatred and contempt and looking down and judgment and all those things that destroy relationships, there has to be self-righteousness. Is that a new thought?
Yes. Makes sense. Yes, it does.
Yeah. You're looking puzzled. No. Yeah. And interestingly, in the context which we haven't gone into tonight, the story immediately preceding is a widow who has no hope of justice. The story immediately following is children who in Jesus' society were not regarded as precious in the way that we regard children as precious and to be cared for. They were not to be given attention or time. And in the middle you've got this other ostracised person who's ritually unclean and regarded as a traitor. So those three categories, the widow, the ostracised person and the child, all illustrate the way in which people regard others with contempt and they never get a fair hearing. Just over the page, at least it is in my Bible, there's the story of the rich man, and in that society the rich man would be the one you think would have it all together. and he goes away very unhappy. And they ask the question, well, who can then enter the kingdom if a rich man can't? In other words, there's this complete reversal of social norms, but right at the core of it is this question of justification and hatred and contempt. In other words, to change the social fabric, you really have to remove that issue of self-justification, which leads to hatred and comparison and judgment. Does that come through?
Yes.
Yeah, what other comments came from around your table?
We talked about how with the Pharisee, he had to bring up that he fasted twice a week and give the 10th of all that he had. And just how this in the self-justification, he had to bring forward, these are all good things that I'm doing. So, yeah, we thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
I think I'm from that too. So culturally, you know, he was very much trying to keep the 10 Commandments. You know, stick to the law and not break the law. I've got to live my life focusing on that. We of course know that we can't do that as Christians, and freedom is in the gospel, and knowing that breaking the 10 Commandments shows us our sin and our need for Jesus to rescue us from that. But amazing that, you know, so self-righteous, and that conviction that he doesn't break the law, when in fact of course he does.
But do you think
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, do you think he was also, when we do that self-justification, it produces, I got to make myself look better. He's not good, and so you do that to make yourself look better too. Is that
That's
what
right.
happens? Yeah.
That's right, it bolsters your own ego. Yeah. The point about the law is very interesting and very helpful. If I can tell a story about my eldest son, when he was at university, we used to live in the UK for a long time, and they were studying at Aberdeen. And he, with a group of others, were standing around talking one day, and there were 2 or 3 Christian blokes in the group and some others who weren't, and one of the friends who didn't have a Christian philosophy about him said, well, you know, I don't know what all of this stuff for forgiveness is about. He said, I've not ever done anything wrong. And my older son said, well, how would you know? It's a very good question. How would you know? And he said, well, I've not murdered or stolen or raped anybody. He said, well, how would you know that would be wrong?
Oh, yes.
In other words, there is something behind our morality, even if our consciences may be aligned to the wrong thing, finally, there's still something behind us. And when you get to the thing that is finally behind, you find that no one lives up to it. And that's, of course, the interesting thing across all cultures, as far as we can observe. No matter what the standards of the law that culture adopts, everyone within that culture somewhere has to recognise even that standard is not one that they're able to live up to. So there's this question all the time about where we find forgiveness. And of course your answer is right, that forgiveness is something given to us as a free gift by God. It's not something that we then earn out ourselves. But yeah, thank you for the comments. Anyone else?
It's almost as if he's saying that we need to feel guilt and shame in order to get forgiveness.
Yeah, well, it is this statement, isn't it? First will be last, last will be first. When you don't think you need, when you have no need. So what use is God to us if we have no need? But the refrain that runs through these parables is, he who exalts himself will be humbled. He who humbles himself, meaning I recognise where I really am, they're the ones who are exalted. Yeah.
They're the people, I suppose, that, like the tax collector as you're saying, and others, the small children perhaps in a different way, but the woman who's at the end of a tether, they're people who come to the end of themselves and who are really utterly without power in society, like you were saying. And that's where God moves, not when we think that God's there to help us. You know, I don't need you to save me, God, I just need you to help me. You know, if I could only just fix this one little aspect of my personality, everything else would be great. But they're the people who recognise that they are absolutely sort of morally and in every other way sort of bankrupt, have nothing to give God, and that's the people who experience givenness and therefore forgiveness.
They're in the basement, aren't they?
They're in the basement.
They're in the basement. We're drawing for a close tonight, but I did want Kirsten, if you don't mind, to comment on one thing which various ones of us might have experienced here, and if we ourselves personally have not experienced, we will probably come across someone who has, and that is the concept and reality of something called survivor guilt. Survivor guilt. Do you just want to talk about that for a minute, about what that is and where do you think it comes from?
So survivor guilt or survivor syndrome, if I'm not wrong, I think came into the literature in around about the 1960s, but researchers and sociologists started perhaps to become more aware of it after the Holocaust. Those who had survived when so many others hadn't, and they felt that there were three aspects to survivor guilt. One, I think, was just the fact that you're alive and perhaps your whole family or so many in your community weren't, or perhaps you're alive and your children weren't alive. And then there's the guilt over what you didn't do that had led to your survival. So perhaps you didn't shelter the Jews who were knocking on your door. Perhaps you didn't stop and offer food to someone when you're doing that might have led to your execution. And there's the guilt over things that you did do. So perhaps you had to crawl over some bodies to get out of the pit after everyone was shot. So, or you know, you had to betray a friend. So you can imagine. I mean, that's a pretty dark picture. But in fact, a lot of us would perhaps have experiences of that from spouses who've passed away before us, or children who have died in car accidents. There are many tragic stories in probably more families than we think of, where someone's run over a child and the child's died in the family. It might have been a parent that's run over a child, or a granny, or an auntie, or something like that. And it's probably every grandparent's nightmare while they're babysitting, that something will happen to the child that they're looking after. It used to be, I think, in the DSM-4, which is the sort of the manual of mental health that we use, but it was taken out, or perhaps was taken out of the DSM-4, and now it's just in a category under post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's one of the features of post-traumatic stress disorder, which doesn't mean that you have to have been through a war zone, but we can experience that from a number of distressing incidents in our lives. Part of it, I think, is dependent on our personalities as to whether we experience that, but I think there's sort of that sense of perhaps why me, like why do I deserve to be alive, and that perhaps gets to the pointy end of things about who we are before God and what our identity actually is. What have I done? So it just shows us, I suppose, what a works-based psyche we have. What have I done that I should be alive when no one else is?
And there's a question there too about, perhaps an innate recognition that death, which that other person died, in one sense, I'm just as justified if it had been me. Like, Like I deserve to die. It's not, the question is not just that I've survived, but I know somehow very deep down I deserve to die and that person did and I didn't. So it does exacerbate this question of the interface between guilt, self-justification and our search for meaning in a sense. We'll come back to again some of this a little bit more next time when in our last gathering we're talking about shame, which is already we've bumped into that this week, but we'll spend some more time on that next time. One of the things that you notice in the shame conversation is that a lot of research at the moment is saying that we in the West are moving far more to become a shame-based culture rather than a guilt-based culture. The traditional analysis was that we were sort of guilt innocence type thinking with an introspective conscience, and other societies, we might think of Southeast Asian societies like Japan and so forth, were more about shame and saving face. That distinction is, if it was ever a solid one, certainly has been lost, and a lot of pressure that we find socially amongst us at the moment is from people feeling shamed because they don't live up to an image of one sort or another. But we'll come back to that next week. Thank you.